Hello and welcome back to the Daily Royal, a podcast that covers the daily events of all the European royal families. Happy 2021, guys. We made it to the new year. Just briefly going to apologize for being completely absent for the last, basically month. I'm not going to go into it a whole lot. My life fell apart for a little bit. We're back. Everything's good. And refocused, recentered, back on this. It's amazing. So, today is January 1st of 2021, and we are really just going to talk about all of the, end of the year speeches from all 7 monarchs that we talk about. So that's the plan for today's episode. Tomorrow is going to be about kind of like a highlight reel of 2020, which is hard because 2020. But a highlight reel and maybe like a here's where we're going type of thing. Pretty much everything is going to stay the same. I'll be back to 5 times a week. Things have changed a little bit on like the back end in terms of the way I'm prioritizing and managing everything, but you don't need to know all of that. Website is still up and running. Instagram's still up and running, and that's what we're keeping. So Twitter will be used sporadically, probably just a lot of retweets through in 2021. Facebook is probably going to be the same thing. If you follow me over there, shares, but not, independent content, at least for the first 6 months. That's where I foresee this going. And then, in 6 months, hopefully things are going well still, and I can figure things out again. That seems to be the process. So with that, the way we are going to do this breakdown of talking about all the different speeches is we're going to talk about Christmas Eve speeches first. So that's Belgium and Spain. Christmas Day, which is the UK, the Netherlands, and Sweden. And then we'll go with New Year's Eve, which I am recording this on New Year's Eve. So it's not 2021 yet for me, which is weird. But there's 6 hours left essentially. So we'll talk about the New Year's Eve speeches, which were Denmark and Norway. So without further ado, we are going to jump right in and start talking about Christmas Eve speeches. So I will definitely be touching on this more in tomorrow's episode, but because these two happened on New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve, sorry, I'm getting all my holidays mixed up because it's that span of 2 weeks where no one knows what day or time it is. That's where I'm at right now. But I just want to give quick props. Again, we'll talk about this more in tomorrow's episode. To the Belgian and Spanish royal families. They went through, aside from just a pandemic, so much other stuff. Truly each royal family did, but Belgium and Spain stood out the most, and they have handled it so well. And then their speeches were some of my favorites. And so I just want to start by saying that mad props to them, because this year was hard, and it was exceptionally hard on their I guess reign. I don't know. There was so much stuff that just happened, and so the way they have handled this year just immensely amazes me. So with that, we are going to now just kind of go into the details of each speech. Sorry, I'm pulling up my document right now because why start it? Why pull it up before I start recording? That's crazy. So here's the rundown on Belgium with like some of the specifics. My favorite part. So King Philippe gave his speech at 6-ish p.m., and maybe it was 7, in Belgium at the end of like an hour-long live program for the Belgian citizens. So this was kind of simultaneously live streamed on each public news station in Belgium. So it was, simulcast in Dutch and French and all of that. This is not normal. So this isn't how this is normally done. This is a 2020 thing because, of course, it is. In Europe, they are having some really strict, lockdown measures, really to prevent a huge wave of COVID. And so a lot of people in Europe are not with their families, weren't with their families. And so they did this so like everyone could feel connected to each other, all 11 million Belgian citizens, plus anyone who live streamed from outside of the country, could all just feel included in this day. So that happened. And then at the very end of that, was Philippe's speech. But I want to talk briefly about the 45-minute program before the speech, where the very first, shots of this, kind of like a, holy crap, it's 2020, and, this is how we're celebrating Christmas, montage. But the first few clips were of each of the 6 members of the Belgian royal family visiting senior care facilities. So they were paired up into obviously pairs. And so the first video was Princess Elizabeth and Prince Emmanuel visiting and playing games and stuff with senior citizens. And the next it was Prince Gabriel and Princess Eleanor. And they were helping with food, carrying boxes of cans and stuff like that. And then the final pairing was King Philippe and Queen Mathilde. And they were at a senior center just talking with the residents there. So that was a really cool thing. This wasn't a super official engagement. Obviously it was videoed. And so this does make it the first official engagement that Princess Elizabeth has done without her parents. She was with her brother, but it was her first one without her parents. So it was pretty important. But yeah, and then came Philippe's 7-minute speech. So obviously this is going to be a running theme. We've got 7 of these to talk about. And the running theme is they all talked about COVID because it's 2020. Of course they did. Sorry, I'm moving around a lot. Let me resettle and stop. Okay, I'm back. So, it was of course focused on COVID and very specifically in this situation, the adaptations that have had to be made for the holiday season. So not leaving, a pod or even your own home to spend the holidays with your family would be normal. None of that obviously was happening, especially in these European countries where people are being pretty good about the pandemic, not, comparable to here in the States where we suck at it. I tried. I still sucked at it. So that was what he talked about. And then he also, this was my favorite quote where he says, it being the pandemic has made us see things differently and appreciate things differently, which how true is that? I'm seeing all of these end of the year reflections on Instagram and other social media accounts. And it's when we started this year, we thought we were going to be able to have everything we wanted this year. It was like our year to shine. It was going to be great, right? Like, I think almost everyone went into that. I went into it being, really optimistic and like, okay, this is my year to achieve a lot of the things that I want to achieve. I did all of that, which is great. But 2020 also taught me, like, achieving and meeting all these goals and all of that isn't really it's not all that life is, right? Like, this year more than ever, I enjoyed being outside and spending time with my family in a more small setting situation, because like I couldn't hang out with them all at once, which honestly worked better for me. Like, I loved that it was one-on-one time. I loved it. Like, it did teach me a lot, and it taught me to appreciate things differently. And so I think, like, that's super important. And so I liked that Philippe's speech really did talk about, like, the silver lining of 2020, because, like, yeah, it's been a really, really tough year, but, like, it did definitely have its benefits. I'm not saying that the good outweighed the bad, but, like, there was good in this year. And so I think it's great that he highlighted on that. And then he finally, like, he finished his speech. That was in English. He finished his speech with a message for younger people, like children, about where he recognized, like, how hard this year has been on them, and acknowledging that their lives have been put on hold. And then he finished about, like, this will soon be over. Soon we'll get back to normal. Next holiday season, we may be able to hug our family again. And I just think, like, yes, because I think it is good going into 2021 reflecting on, like, okay, there's a vaccine, there is some light at the end of this tunnel. Next year, yeah, we actually may be able to hug people again. And I think that was really important that he mentioned that. And so that was King Philippe's speech. It was followed by, and we might talk about this tomorrow, I think he is the only one who had approval numbers. Nope, he's not. But it was followed by, like, his annual approval numbers, and we'll talk about all of that tomorrow. But, like, he came out of this year with flying colors, just given how hard the year was. Just a little bit of reflection for me. Again, we'll talk about this more tomorrow. When I started this podcast, probably like a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, it was announced that King Philippe's father had a child out of wedlock through an extramarital affair. Throughout that year, that child, Delphine, has been given a title, has had her last name changed, and, like, has kind of started life in the royal family, or at least royal family adjacent. It was just a really dramatic year, and, like, Philippe has come out of it with flying colors. So that was his Christmas Eve speech. And now we are going to move on to King Felipe's speech in Spain. King Felipe gave his speech. It was a pre-recorded speech at 9 p.m. because when in Spain, you stay up extremely late. Normally, doesn't have to be a holiday. It's normal to stay up late. Children are still up at 9 p.m. in Spain. So his was broadcast then. It went live. It came out of embargo at 9 p.m. And then it was also streamed on YouTube by basically every news channel, but also by Casa Real, which is the royal household. And before the 15-minute speech, it was preceded by, like, an hour-long video year in review that Casa Real puts out every year. This was not their first year doing it. This is something they do every year. But I was shocked that it was able to be an hour long, because for 60 days, King Felipe and Queen Letizia were in confinement, because all of Spain was. Like, no one was leaving. No one was going anywhere. And so they were, having video calls. But they managed to make it 60 minutes, which was crazy. And it was, like, a lot of repetitiveness, because that's what the year was for everybody. But, like, they did it in a really good way. So I was impressed. And then following that on YouTube, the message was then broadcast to a record-breaking 10.7 million people in Spain, which we'll talk about why in, like, 1 second. But 10.7 million people watched this speech, which is crazy. I still haven't figured out if it's, like, good or bad yet that so many people watched this, but it was an impressive amount of people anyway. So again, the speech, generally focused on the pandemic, with a specific focus on healthcare workers and, like, again, the silver linings of the pandemic, where people throughout Spain have really learned to work together in this common goal of protecting each other from COVID. So he, of course, talked about healthcare workers and then the effects on the economy, but how everyone has band together to keep smaller businesses in business and keep people safe and, like, do all the things that need to be done. And so he then, talked about how the COVID response is a national effort. He commended the Spanish people for their resiliency. And then he talked about how, like, he and Queen Letizia had seen a lot of that resiliency in person during their tour of each of the autonomous communities where they met. I mean, they met nonprofit workers and, when I say sanitation, I mean, like, garbage collectors, which are so much more important in a pandemic than you would have ever thought. And, like, they just meet with the people doing the work. So he talked about that. And then came the part that I'm assuming is why 10.7 million people tuned in. It's what I was looking for. I mean, I was looking at it as a whole, but, like, when I was watching it live, or reading it, like, it's what I was reading for the first time. And it was whether Felipe would directly and or indirectly talk about the situation that the Spanish royal family is in. We've talked about this a lot, but former King Juan Carlos, who is King Felipe's father, did some shady stuff while he was king and after. He is now voluntarily in exile in the United Arab Emirates. And, like, more and more drama has just come out. The use of credit cards not in his name, by him and some of his family members. Again, not King Felipe, Queen Letizia, or their children, but some other members of the family. And just this, like, Juan Carlos had this general feeling of superiority that he could do whatever he wanted because he was king. And he's getting caught over and over and over again. And so that has been a big thing for the Spanish royal family all year. That drama came out initially. It started in about the same time frame as the pandemic. It was maybe 3 days before the pandemic really hit and lockdown really hit. And so it's been not buried, but, like, hasn't been at the forefront of everyone's mind because we're living in a pandemic. And so what he ended up saying and talking about, he did everything indirectly. He never mentioned his father or any of the what I call shady stuff. That's my personal opinion of it. Is it's shady, and you don't get to do that. But Felipe focused a lot about his commitment to democracy, his commitment to being an ethical head of state, and being transparent and being communicative. And, now that it's, 7 days later, we're learning that he has talked about, or he is part of conversations about reforms on the monarchy and like what their power is and what they can do and what they're responsible for, and he's open to a lot of it. And so I think, I'm glad he talked about it in the way he did. I think it was good. I was hoping that he wouldn't go super direct because that would be all anyone talked about, even though it's still all anyone's talking about. But then he ended with what is potentially my favorite thing from, everyone, every monarch this year, is that he ended with, "It will not be difficult for 2021 to improve upon 2020 because, y'all, 2020 has been rough." And so I appreciate that each monarch has pretty much acknowledged that. And I applaud Felipe for saying, like, it'll not be difficult for 2021 to be better because 2020 has been awful. But again, like previously he had talked about like the resiliency he saw and stuff like that. So it was a really good speech. It was great. And so with that, we are going to move on to the Christmas Day speeches after we take a quick break and listen if we have any sponsors. And we are at Christmas Day. So we've made it to Christmas Day. These speeches were pretty run-of-the-mill, which I hate saying, but like they were. They weren't highly anticipated other than Queen Elizabeth's. Hers is always highly anticipated. And then we also had on Christmas Day King Willem-Alexander and King Carl Gustaf giving their speeches to their countrymen. So we'll start with Queen Elizabeth. So her speech came out of embargo at 3 p.m. all across the UK and online. So that for me was, 10, I think. There was nothing preceding the speech other than like a quick fanfare. So Queen Elizabeth's was the shortest speech at about 5.5 minutes. Obviously, again, focused on the pandemic, with an emphasis on the sadness about not gathering. So she talked about, of course, we can't gather during Christmas, but also throughout this year, many other religions, including Christians, have found ways to adapt to holding their holidays. So she mentioned Passover, Diwali, which is a Hindu holiday, and like so many others, Eid, which I don't think is its own holiday. It very well could be. I don't know. I'm not perfectly cultured, but I truly think like Eid is 2 different time frames, but I could be wrong. I don't want to be insensitive, so I will preface that I'm probably wrong. She has staff and researchers and everyone to make sure she gets it right. So that was, obviously the starting point of her message. This always gets a lot of attention from Elizabeth because she usually has several pictures of her family, and this year it was just one picture of Prince Philip beside her from probably like 20, maybe even 30 years ago. So I thought that was notable. Other royals really didn't have that many photos around them. King Felipe did in Spain. He had a picture of him and his daughter, Princess Leonor. but that was the only other person that I think had pictures. Maybe Carl Gustav. We'll see. He's down the script a little bit. And then she went in to talk about hope. She shared the parable of the Good Samaritan that can be found in the Bible. She also talked about the 100th anniversary of the tomb of the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey, where she intentionally connected that to the ability to put others before ourselves. Again, in a time of a pandemic where younger, healthier people ideally are putting people they may see ahead of themselves, their grandparents, etc. I know that's something like I'm not always perfect about, but like I do try and like if I've, experienced any COVID exposure or have any kind of symptoms of COVID, like I will not see my grandmother for 2 weeks. Even if, I've been tested and I've been negative, like I still am like, just to be on the safe side. Just making sure like other people and like the country are before themselves. So Elizabeth tied the unknown warrior to that because he was willing to sacrifice for a better Britain. I've listened or read all 7 of these now, and I will say Queen Elizabeth was the most based in the Christian religion of them all. Look, this is nothing more than an acknowledgement of that. Like I said, she did mention a lot of other religious holidays from other religions and other cultures. But Queen Elizabeth has never made a secret about how she is in her faith. And like as the head of the Church of England, I think she is well within her right. Also, it was Christmas. People talk about Christmas because it is the celebration formed down to its very core being. It is a celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ. Believe that, don't believe that. That is what Christmas was. I know that secular people celebrate Christmas all over the world because it has been made the norm. I get that. So I just wanted to briefly mention, though, that hers was based the most in religion, which is not a fault, and it was not surprising whatsoever, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. And then her address ended, and we went to like a new shot of some members of the NHS choir. So the National Health Service has a choir that were stationed socially distanced in Windsor Castle. I think it was Windsor. It was like a very long hallway. And they sang the carol Joy to the World. And that was the end of her broadcast. I think the whole thing was like 15 minutes long. But this is something that people like wait around on Christmas Day, is let's listen to the Queen, and then we'll do, presents or whatever you have. So I think that was just a really great way of like ending this really odd year's Christmas. And so with that, we're going to move on now to King Willem-Alexander's address to the people of the Netherlands. So Willem-Alexander's speech started in the most different way. He started his address with a monologue of stories that he has heard throughout his working visits all this year. So obviously he and Queen Maxima have been visiting lots of different sectors affected by the pandemic, as every other monarch has. And he just, in the speech he gave, really shared some of those stories that he heard from, small business owners or healthcare workers or senior citizens in senior care facilities, all of that. So I thought that was a really interesting way to start it. Really more poetic than everyone else's so far. And then, of course, look, again, COVID. Like, everybody, of course, is going to talk about COVID this year because it's so specific to the world. So he talked about that, but he had more of a, like, due to his situation through the year, he had more of a, like, what is the word that I want to use? He really focused on the fact that life is not black and white. There are nuances in the world, and, like, some of the joy and beauty of life is found in that gray area. He talked about how, if someone doesn't agree with you in now's time, they become your enemy, which is accurate. It's an accurate representation, right? I mean, I don't know that it's... I know it's not the right way to do things, but it's the easier way to do things. Is if, okay, someone disagrees with me, I can't talk to this person. I can't be friends with this person. I have trouble relating to this person. And so, like, he talked about, like, don't fall into that trap, and don't, negate someone from your life in any way, shape, or form because they don't agree with you on, an issue. Not that the issue isn't important, but, like, have those conversations, find the beauty in the compromise or whatever. I think it was really great. He spoke of forgiveness, and in that he shared a passage from the book of Corinthians in the Bible that is kind of, I know it as, like, the wedding Bible verse. You hear it at every wedding, but it's the love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, and that's all I know from memory. And so he talked about those, and, like, this beauty of forgiveness and all of that, which, knowing the year that he's had, and again, we'll talk about this more tomorrow in, like, the 2020 review episode. It's just, like, I like that he talked about it. And then, he ended his speech about, light returning, which is, again, based in, like, the Christian faith of Jesus is the light. And so when he was born on Christmas Day, the light returned to the world. And so, using Christmas as a metaphor for the fact that there is a light at the end of this horrible year that we have all lived through together. So with that was his speech. It was about 6.5 minutes long. And now we are moving on to the speech that King Carl Gustaf gave in Sweden. King Carl Gustaf's speech was actually a lot different than I expected it to be. So the broadcast came from Drottningholm Castle, which is his primary residence. He and Queen Sylvia primarily reside there, not in the Royal Palace in Stockholm. But that's where their offices are, is in the Royal Palace. And so that's usually where the Christmas broadcast is done. And for the first time, I think probably of his 30 plus, oh gosh, it's probably, I don't quite know how long he's been on the throne. It's been a long time. 45-ish years. The broadcast was done from Drottningholm because of the pandemic. And so his speech was the most surprising in that, yes, it was focused on COVID, but it was really well crafted in this, like, conversation about tradition and using Drottningholm as, like, and the change of tradition as, like, a catalyst for how different 2020 has been. And so he talked about like some of his childhood traditions and how, this year children aren't experiencing their normal traditions because we're living in the pandemic. He talked about responsibilities that each citizen has taken during this pandemic. I think people were maybe expecting a little bit more of not a cynical note, but like a little bit different, because he recently, he didn't come under fire or anything, but he talked about the failure of Sweden in the way they handled the pandemic. And the prime minister understands, like, Sweden took a different approach in which they thought the best way to do this would be herd immunity. And it turned out it wasn't. And a lot of Swedes lost their lives to COVID because of the way this was done, but also because it's COVID. And so it was a really good balance of how people in Sweden were feeling. Their traditions are hopefully not happening because of the pandemic and protection, but also, like, this year has been hard, and Swedish citizens didn't make the choice to rely on herd immunity. Their government did, and so there's a lot of frustration and hurt and grief right now. And so I think, like, the way Carl Gustav talked about the change in tradition in his life, and also, like, the responsibility that people hold to each other, I think it was a really different, cool way of doing so. And so that covers the Christmas Day speeches. I know this is getting really long, but we only have Christmas Day or New Year's Eve to go, so that's what we're going to go into right after another quick break if we have any sponsors. Final stretch, we are covering the speeches for me today, the New Year's Eve speeches from Queen Margrethe in Denmark and King Harald in Norway. So I don't know why these two do New Year's Eve versus Christmas, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. It definitely falls into, like, what is their country's traditions now at this point. So I think it's great. Also, it, gave me plenty to do today, which was awesome. So, we are going to start with Queen Margrethe's speech. So she is, from what I can tell, the only monarch who delivers her speech live. At least that I talk about. So it went live at around 6 p.m. I think it was like 6 p.m. and maybe 6:01 or something. On New Year's Eve, it was broadcast on all of the state-run media, which is, of course, like, I think I should preface this, if you're from the States, we think of state-run media as a bad thing. It's not. Actually, it's kind of like PBS is... the Public Broadcasting Network has government financial support, and they, like, present the information that way. It's not that the government has a ton of control. It's just the government finances it to make sure that people are able to get access to quality news. Most of the time. There are countries who use it wrongly, like Russia and China and other countries as well, but for the most part, countries use it well. So I just wanted to, like, preface that. So Margrethe's speech started by talking about how we went into 2020 with such high expectations. It's funny. I actually didn't go into 2020 with high expectations. It started a few days later. There was like a catalyst moment in my life that was like, start living your life, start doing and trying for the things that you want. And that was, I can't remember the exact day that happened, but when it happened, it was like, I was going to do everything I wanted. And it like, that's when it started. So shortly after, like within the next 2 days, I started this podcast, and just really started, but that's not how I started 2020. I just went like, okay, here's some things that I maybe want to do in 2020. But there was never like a focused way to do it. And here we are now. It's like, okay, wow. But that catalyst moment for me was really important. But again, we went into 2020, or we started 2020 with really strong expectations of what this year would bring us, and what we could do with it. And instead, we got a global pandemic that started in March. And so it was not what we hoped for. It was not what we expected. And so I like that Margaretha just acknowledged that this year, like, let us down. In a way, I always hear like, gosh, every year is going to be better than the last. But I also feel like going into 2021, there's this sense of like, yeah, it's probably going to be better than 2020 because we handled 2020. Like we got through it. There's some strength in the resiliency that we've all demonstrated this year. And so I like the way Margaretha kind of went through the year, in the year of COVID. So, she started by saying like, in March in March, COVID came to Europe. I think that was in February, but like she went through everything. She talked about the continuing restrictions that the Danish people have while they kind of wait for this return to life as we knew it, which I don't know that it'll ever be that, but like the day when we can hug each other again, or, whatever that moment is where it's like, we're no longer living in complete and total fear of COVID. Or not even fear, but like, we want to be so protective. We want to be very safe. We want to be very cautious. We want to protect those around us. Like, I think it was awesome. And then she talked about how a lot of things got canceled, which, oh my gosh, in Denmark, there were so many things that got canceled. Specifically, I think one of the most important events to me, I mean, the Olympics were pretty important to me this year, but also, like, I was so excited for Margaretha's 80th birthday. That was the first thing, like, in terms of this podcast and royal watching, that I was, like, really intensely bummed out about. So her 80th birthday and the galas and everything was canceled, obviously, because it was in April. But then she talked about, like, how special her birthday was anyway. She said, like, never before did I feel so celebrated, because we found different ways. The world found different ways to celebrate her birthday. Again, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, but I would say, like, the highlight of 2020 in terms of royal watching for me was the video that every European royal made to send to Margaretha for her 80th birthday. Like, I mean, come on, it was perfect. And so I just think, like, she focused on all of that really, really well. And then she ended it. This was by far one of my favorites. King Felipe's is probably still a little bit better to me because it was so honest. But Margaretha ended with saying, "Today we say goodbye to a strange year. We will not forget 2020." Which is just so true. This year has been strange. I am ready to be on the other side of it. Like I said, I'm about 6 hours away still, so, but I'm ready to be in the new year. And it was just a strange year. So I'm, recording this now, and then I'm going to have my personal reflection time of 2020 as soon as I get this uploaded and ready to post for you all. So that was the Danish speech. And now it is finally time to end with the final speech of the year from King Harald of Norway that he gave this evening. So King Harald started his speech. There was like a little prelude, and I don't know how I have lived. I noticed it once, but I didn't think anything of it. I've lived through this entire year of this podcast and never known that there's a specific song for like the monarch in Norway. It's called the King's Song. But it's the same tune and a lot of the same lyrics, just translated to God Save the Queen. I was so confused when Harald's speech came on, because I was like, wait a minute, what? So, yep, there is a song in Norway called the King's Song, and it is literally basically God Save the Queen, but in Norwegian. So I noticed it once at like the opening of Parliament, but I didn't think anything of it. I just was like, well, that's really weird. But like, it didn't recognize until tonight when I like looked into it a little bit further. So that was an interesting little tidbit. But then let's see. Okay. So King Harald was in black tie, which is like my hands down favorite outfit of all of these speeches. Let's talk about like there isn't a whole lot of variation when you see men in suits. And Queen Elizabeth and Queen Margaretha, I was like let down by their choice of outfits. But that's fine, because Harald was in black tie, which meant like a black bow tie and a suit and a tux. It was great. So happy. But he started his speech. So unfortunately, yesterday, there was a landslide in Norway, in Gjerdrum. That was a very French way of saying that, but in this town in Norway. So he started his speech by sending condolences to the people in that town. He talked a lot about, again, the year of cancellations. Norway is another country that has just been through a lot this year, like a lot. It's been a really painful year for Norway, and then King Harald has had a significant amount of health problems. And then also, like, there was a global pandemic. So it was, of course, just like a really tough year. And one thing that, like, is harder for a lot of people to remember, and I've only talked about it, a couple of times on this podcast throughout the year, is that King Harald, his childhood, it's not that it was traumatic. I mean, it was, but he lived through a war. He was literally a refugee during the Second World War. He and his mother and his sister came and they lived in the U.S. While Norway was being invaded by Nazis. And so that's a very defining moment for him, of course. And what he talked about is he receives letters, of course, every monarch does, about all of this. And in one of the letters, a child asked him if he was 100. And he said, well, I'm not. I've lived a lot and I've seen a lot of things. And the one thing I know is we'll get through this. And I think he hasn't had the opportunity because of his health this year and also a pandemic and his age and just kind of all of that, he hasn't had too many times to show his genuine connection to these issues, and like the way people are feeling. But he has always been the monarch who can connect with it the best. He was the first one out of the gate with speeches about the pandemic, where he addressed people's fears, when it was safe to do so, in that temporary window we had of like a lower amount of cases. It was, in Europe, it was a dip before the second wave. He met with younger people or teenagers, and, kids said, it's hard. We can't hug people, and like, that's really stupid. And he said, he didn't, according to the reports, he didn't talk about it being stupid or calling it any names, but like, he just connected with them and let them be mad, because sometimes it's okay to be mad about 2020. I don't get mad very often. I get really sad about it a lot. And I get really nervous about it way more than I should. But he just gave people the space to have their feelings about COVID, which is so important. And something like, as a person in the States, I don't feel like my head of state gave me the opportunity to be mad about that. He wanted me to be mad about other things, but not about the pandemic or the way the pandemic was affecting my life. Like, there wasn't a safe place to have those feelings. And so I had to create my own, which was fine. I'm able to do that. But like, some people didn't know how. And I think like Harold really knew to connect with people that way. He also mentioned in his speech, and I think he might have been the only one to do so, about like kids graduating from high school or college, and like this moment. My high school graduation was not important to me whatsoever. My college graduation was the most important thing to me, probably the most important event in my life so far. And like, it was 10 years, it wasn't 10 years ago, it was 6 years ago, but like, I got to experience it and I got to enjoy it. And like, I know people who are graduating, who graduated in 2020, who were just, it was hard because they didn't get to celebrate. They didn't get that moment that like I will remember the rest of my life. And I know a lot of people graduating this in 2021 who are very nervous that they won't be able to experience graduation. And it is this like super defining moment. And so he, I think, is the only monarch who mentioned them, and like congratulated them and acknowledged their achievement, in their like annual speech. So he got the mark on like how to be a head of state in a pandemic, especially when people haven't seen you a lot this year because it's a pandemic and he's old and he's had health problems all year. So I just like, I thought it was really great. I also think that he will be experiencing his 30th anniversary on the throne in the next couple of weeks. And I think that's like, he mentioned that very briefly. I think that's when that happens. It's just like it was a really good speech and I was very happy for it. And so that brings us to the end of the year speeches. It brings us to the end of the year. So, thank you so much. I will talk to you all tomorrow where we'll do a much more in-depth 2020 review. Part of my like personal review is going to be, over this podcast would have been some of my highlights through the year. What are some big moments that each royal family has experienced? And that's what tomorrow is going to be. So we are going to move into that. And I wish you all a very, very happy new year. And I will talk to you all tomorrow. Bye.